Does anybody know what official day it is today?
Sunday.
It is Sunday. Thank you. It's a very specific kind of Sunday. And if you don't know, I put it up on the screen. Today is Low Sunday. Did you know that? How many of you knew it was Low Sunday today? Well, you've got an education coming for you today. See, last week was High Sunday because the attendance today compared to last Sunday is but a wee fraction. Somebody was thinking, though, every year, the Sunday after Easter, it's like at 9:30, these first 6 rows were empty, and everybody was huddled back there. A week ago Sunday, we had to set up chairs, and there were people actually sitting close. And I showed up to the 11 o'clock service this morning, and there were people sitting up close, and I went, oh, 4-year-olds. You certainly didn't sit up close to see me. That was pretty wise thinking, because on Low Sunday, the week after Easter, people generally don't come. They don't come to church. But it's Low Sunday not just for the numbers of people who attend. There's a little bit of an emotional letdown. Last Sunday was Elation Sunday. This week's a little more like deflation. It reminds me of some time in Vegas. In Vegas, I know, we're back to gambling again. What are you going to do? Actually, Las Vegas is known for buffets, okay, just so you know that. When I was a pastor in Vegas, what we did on Easter is we would fill all of these balloons with helium. There were balloons everywhere. We'd get up super early, and the high school kids would come in, and we'd fill all these balloons. We'd even tie them to the communion rail. Ooh, it's kind of scary. One of those years, I came back the following week, and somebody had forgotten to remove the balloons. Now, the balloons on Easter were almost to the point of bursting, so in fact, at times they would, and you'd be kind of wondering, when is that balloon going to burst? That was not the case the week after Easter. There was no way those balloons were going to burst because they had lost much of their air, and they were barely floating above the ground, and it was kind of creepy. That's the difference between Easter Sunday and the week after. Somebody has let the air out of our balloons. Now, before you get upset and think I'm just being a Donnie Downer, I said Debbie Downer at the early one, and somebody said, can't you just say a man's name? Okay. So Donnie Downer, I think the Sunday after Easter is supposed to be that way. I think the Sunday after Easter is supposed to be a little bit of an emotional letdown. Because even as we gather on Easter and celebrate, and we're excited about all the things that are Easter, and yes, the most important thing, that Christ is actually alive, he's been raised from the dead, we can't live our lives in euphoria. We have to come back down to earth. And we have to walk the way of the Christian life in the world like just about everybody else. And there are a whole lot more potholes than hallelujahs in our lives, right? We have to deal with sick kids. We have to deal with turmoil in our lives, broken relationships. And so there's a little bit of irony that on this Low Sunday, we get this story that you heard at the children's message about Thomas, otherwise known as? Well, that's pretty good. You guys learn how to do those kind of things. The story about doubting Thomas. So it's the day of resurrection, and there's a rumor that's floating about saying, Jesus, he might be alive. But see, the disciples locked in this room weren't quite sure, because the only 2 people who had seen Jesus were women, and 2 women, and the disciples thought they were delusional. And yet there they are in this room. And Jesus appears. He doesn't walk through a door. He doesn't crawl through a window. He just shows up. And he tells them, peace I give you. And then he says some interesting words. And he says, the sins that you forgive, they're forgiven. The sins that you retain, they're retained. And that's where the church gets this understanding that the priest or the pastor will stand up and say something like, after you've confessed a sin, they'll say, in the stead and by the command of my Lord Jesus Christ, I forgive you. That goes back to those words that Jesus shared on that first resurrection when he told the disciples, now you go and share forgiveness. Well, turns out that 10 of the disciples are there. 10 out of 11. Some cardinal hitters could stand to hit 10 out of 11. By the way, I think Adam Wainwright might be the best hitter on the Cardinals team. But no Cardinal fans in the house, right? I'm a Minnesota Wild fan, so I have to switch over to the Cardinals because I'm in mourning today. But yeah, you have fun with that, Tom. So, where were we? We're talking about sports and gambling today. We should probably talk about Jesus a little bit. Thomas isn't there. 10 out of 11. Why wasn't Thomas there? Is it possible that this was the case? Have you noticed that people mourn differently? Some people, when they mourn, they want to be around people. They want to be strengthened and encouraged by their loved ones, their family, their friends. Other people, they want to be left alone. Maybe Thomas was mourning Jesus' loss by himself. So the disciples have this great reaction. Jesus is alive. Jesus is alive. And they find Thomas and they tell him, Thomas, you missed it, buddy. Jesus has risen. He's alive. And we get Thomas's now infamous response. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I can't believe it. And I won't believe it unless I can take my hand and touch the holes, unless I can put my hand in his side. And I stop and think about that for a second. What is the deal with that? Now, there are especially kids like this. One of my kids a long time ago, I won't give you any indication of what child it is. I might stand in front of that child, but I'm not sure. I'm left-handed, so I fall down a lot. And I had this cut on my knee, and it was kind of bloody. And this said child comes in, looks, and goes, does that hurt? You know, it's bleeding because it feels grand. Don't touch the boo-boo. Thomas says, unless I shove my hand into the sores, I'm not going to believe it. He needed some sort of proof. A week passes by and God is forgiving and gracious, and he's going to give Thomas an opportunity, a chance. Thomas is now there. And note, Thomas is there. Something I think that's missed very easily. In fact, I missed it for some 20 years. Thomas was not excluded from the family just because he was going through a faith crisis. Remember that the next time maybe one of your kids comes to you and says, I don't believe what you believe. If he or she is Thomas, they're still at the dinner table. Thomas is there. And Jesus walks right over to him and says, Thomas, go ahead. Put your hands here. Stop disbelieving and believe. And Thomas's response is, my Lord and my God, you are alive. It's true. But the crux of this story, the most important part of this story, isn't so much the interaction with Thomas. It's what Jesus says after that. He says, Thomas, do you believe because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. Who do you suppose Jesus is talking about? He's talking about you and me. The ones who hear the Easter story and walk away believing. The ones who pray to a God they cannot see. The ones who trust in a Jesus they cannot touch and somehow still know that it is the truth. In effect, Jesus says to Thomas, and he says to us this: the Christian life is not lived on the mountaintop with a mountaintop experience, but in the valleys, and some of those valleys are deep and they are dark. It was really easy to sing the Alleluias last Sunday as people poured in to our worship center. But what about on Low Sunday? What about on Low Tuesday? What about on Low Thursday night when life is hard and proof of God's love seems so absent? Jesus says that when we still believe at those times, we'll be blessed. Having said that, Jesus doesn't leave us without some sort of tangible evidence. There are little pieces of bread and little cups of wine up there. And more importantly, there are those words that are repeated, given and shed for you for the forgiveness of sins. The tangible evidence that Jesus is alive. And whether we have the emotion or elation as we receive these gifts, it is good news for us because Jesus is giving us his peace. He's given us life in his name. And Low Sunday doesn't change that promise. Unemployment doesn't change that promise. Divorce doesn't change that promise. Bankruptcy does not change that promise. Cancer does not change that promise. Depression does not change that promise. Failure of any kind, emotions of any kind does not change the promise. Through elation and deflation and every emotion in between, the truth remains: Jesus is the Christ. He is the Son of God, and he is alive. And we have life in his name. Thanks be to God for such a life.